Parker to lead us in the dialogue that digs deeper than just the statistics, and we'll talk more about where we're at as a community and get community insight. Hopefully we can have a dialogue about this, and we'll have Lakiana also lead us into part of the discussion about just other current state of gun violence in our community right now. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Brody. We're like 5 minutes ahead of schedule, unless other PCCEP members want to add any updates before we get started. All right, Brody and Marlon, you're up.
Thank you. Could you allow me to share my screen?
I don't know, but somebody can.
Sure, I'll get on that.
Thanks, Theo.
Okay, we have a presentation. Before I even start the presentation, actually, I would like to give our presenters a chance to introduce themselves. I'll go first since I'm already talking. I'm Brody Sargent. I'm the program specialist for the Equity and Inclusion Office, which means I work on like special projects under the direction of my boss, Marlon Marion, who can introduce himself now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marlon Marion. I'm the Equity and Inclusion Manager for the Portland Police Bureau, pronouns he, him, his. And we're also going to be presenting with two other speakers who are here with us today. And I'll pass it to one of them. I'll pass it to Jen.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jen Holmesworth-Reed, and I'm the Records Manager for Portland Police Bureau. And I will lastly pass it to Laura John.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura John. I'm Blackfeet and Seneca. I serve as the city's Tribal Relations Director in our Office of Government Relations. Thanks.
So we are today presenting on the topic of race data and how race data is collected and what that means for the Portland Police Bureau. So we've already done our introductions. So to start off, I think a little bit of history, although I'm sure this is probably just a refresher for many people here, is why we have racial categories in the first place, which the point is of these categories is that they're not and never have been like a natural way to view human difference, but they were culturally created around Eurocentrism, specifically along power dynamics in the Americas. So the first US Census category had 3 categories in which people were recorded: free white men and women, free other persons, and slaves. And so these have always kind of been somewhat unnatural groupings. If you've ever looked at categories, you may ask, how come Europe, a fairly small piece of land, gets a category that's the same as everything from the tip of Alaska to the tip of to the southernmost tip of Argentina? And it's because these categories have been really created over time to kind of fit a Eurocentric, specifically within the United States. And now I want to pass it off to Laura to talk a little bit about kind of the use of history of racial data at kind of the state and federal level.
Thanks, Brody. So the history of collecting race and data, as Brody mentioned, went back to really identifying those that would be excluded. And that was the trend in the United States for a long time. And we see that in a lot of policies when we look at historical policies. Oregon is one of those that was intended to be a white-only state. And so you had to demonstrate your whiteness in order to be allowed to own land. And that also was the expectation of people who were Native. There are state and federal requirements to, I'm looking at the wrong screen here, hold on. Zoom gives me 2 screens, it's really bizarre. There we go. State and federal agencies are required to collect racial data, and there's a reason for that. That data helps not only to determine what are the needs out there, population needs, to that data that is collected is used to build budgets. in particular for American and Alaska Native people and for tribal governments. That data helps to set the funding that they receive under certain programs. And that is true for states as well. The federal requirements were set, and OMB is the agency that set those definitions and have set those definitions over time of what the different racial categories are. If you look back on the history, there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason. It's really interesting to look back and see that until about the 1960s, it was very inconsistent and a lot of times didn't make sense. But since the 60s, data on race and ethnicity have been used extensively in civil rights monitoring and enforcement, covering such areas as employment, law, voting rights, housing, education, healthcare. And so really, I think at that point in the 60s, when it became very clear that there were disparities, there were folks who were in a progressive mindset to say that we need to collect this data so that we can track and monitor those disparities that may be showing up in communities of color. And so that's a big part of how data informs equity work, and is important for being able, particularly with law enforcement data, for being able to keep track of which communities are being victimized. That is absolutely the case when we are talking about the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I don't know if you all saw the recent report that came out from the state of Oregon. I think it said that there was a total of 12 missing Native women, which is a significant undercount. But there are a lot of challenges. Oftentimes, data systems aren't communicating with each other. And there are efforts right now to put in policies to remedy that issue. I'll pass it to Jen now.
Great, thanks, Laura. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the use of race data within police sources. And while I use police as a shorthand, I do mean criminal justice system and law enforcement, also sort of all in that same term. So for race data was collected in the US Census. It really began being collected for the purpose of criminal justice or law enforcement in the late 1800s, when the census began collecting race data from folks who were incarcerated. And the logic behind that was that if they collected the racial information or background of people who were incarcerated, they would be able to get a picture of the crime going on. Of course, we know that was not true, because even back then they recognized very quickly, the early data scientists that were working then, that there's differential sentencing that occurs, right? And differences in who is convicted of crimes and differences in who becomes incarcerated. So they did recognize that just collecting racial data on those who were incarcerated did not provide an accurate picture of who was committing crimes, and it provided no picture whatsoever on who was being victimized or surviving crimes. So in the 1920s, there was this burgeoning movement between socially progressive scientists, particularly within sociology and some other fields, as well as within policing, to actually implement a standardized system for collecting race data in policing. And some of that was driven by perceptions in the 1920s of rampant crime waves that were occurring, which actually, apparently a lot of police chiefs thought there weren't actually crime waves, but they wanted to be able to support their perceptions with data one way or another. So in the very late 1920s, we had our first federal efforts at collecting what we now call the Uniform Crime Reporting, which was our most recent system of collecting crime statistics. And that included data on both known suspects of crimes, as well as people who are victims. And please forgive me for using the term victim. That's the term that is used in that system, but it's also synonymous with survivor, depending upon the type of crime. And then the other thing I'll add in is, while we have this federal standard, which comes to us via the FBI, states can collect more data than is required. And in fact, Oregon recently began collecting data on bias crimes that occur. And that's a joint effort between police, district attorney's office, and there's also some bias crime hotlines that folks can contact if they do not feel comfortable interacting directly with the criminal justice system. Okay, I will pass it back, I believe, to Laura as we move to our next slide.
Thanks. I kind of got my notes out of order, so I did already give you the information that I was going to give on why race data is collected. How it's collected is in a lot of different ways, right? So we have census, we have federal requirements on states to collect data, and then states put requirements on local governments to collect data. There is expectations of collecting data in healthcare systems, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways in which data is collected. Where there is a positive in the OMB setting that standard and states and then local governments following those standards is that it's uniform across all of the data that is being submitted. And I think that's important to bring to this conversation, that there really is whatever OMB is setting as those definitions for collecting race, it sort of trickles down from there. And so if at the OMB level, if that data isn't being collected appropriately or accurately, or excuse me, being defined, such as race and ethnicity categories, then that will influence that whole system of data collection. As I mentioned, oh, go ahead. OMB.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
I was a little too early. I was just going to start talking about how we collect data. So Barbara, thanks for that question. OMB is the Office of Management and Budget. So that's a federal level office that defines a whole lot of things. One of them is, as Laura mentioned, the race categories that are used across many, many different domains, including criminal justice. Laura, did you have anything to add before we go on to collection? Perfect. Okay. So I'll just really briefly sort of talk about how we collect racial data before I get into the definitions, because I think that's where we're looking for some input from PCCEP. So data are collected primarily based on officers' perceptions of the person that they're interacting with. So typically officers are, interacting with someone, and they will, in a police report, document someone's race, or if they have performed a traffic stop, we mandate here in Oregon that they collect data on the perceived race of the person that they stopped. And sometimes they may ask a person directly for their race, but oftentimes it is just based on how the officer perceives that person. Brody, if you want to move to the next slide, and let's actually go into what our definitions are. So on the left-hand side, I realized we did not define what NIBRS is. So NIBRS is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. That is the most current iteration of the crime statistics system that we have to report to the FBI. These definitions that you see here, I will apologize, they're not ideal. These are the NIBRS definitions, which really are truly just the OMB definitions. So these definitions have been largely unchanged for about the last 45 years. So the current definitions have been mostly in place since about 1977. In 1997, they split apart the Asian and Pacific Islander category. So it used to be one category. Now we have one category for Asian, which you can see covers the entire Asian continent, sorry about that, lumping together people from very disparate cultures and geographic areas, right? So Asian includes both folks from China as well as Pakistan and Bangladesh. In the 90s, so they split off Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander and separated that out from the Asian category. In 2016, there was a proposal that OMB, we thought, was going to put into place, which would have added the first new category in 20 years, and that would have been to add a category for Middle Eastern and North African. Currently, right now, someone who hails from the Middle East or whose ancestry is from the Middle East or from North Africa would actually be categorized as white under this definition. And again, as I mentioned, this is based on officer perceptions. A lot of that can cause problems, right? So I can tell you, I would be willing to bet you all a cup of coffee that if an officer were to list me on a police report, they're probably going to list me as white. But on my father's side, I am Creek and Haida. And so the box that I generally check for myself is American Indian. And that is one of those things that just goes to show that the perceptions are not ideal. Yeah. Brody, do we want to move on to the next slide? Ooh, and thanks for that example, Laura, in chat of some of the other changes that have occurred in OMB. And I will say those OMB definitions do drive the categories in the census as well. So the other thing that we collect is ethnicity data. I've found that some folks sometimes are like, well, why isn't Latino or Hispanic listed under the race categories? And it's because under this sort of artificial construction we've created of race and ethnicity, Hispanic or Latino is considered an ethnicity. And so it's sort of a way to subdivide an existing category. So in this system, you know, the options are either Hispanic or Latino, not Hispanic or Latino, or unknown. You'll notice that it does not address any other possibility of ethnicities, right? So one that comes to mind is folks from China. They might be Han Chinese, they might be Uyghur Chinese, they may be some other ethnicity, which just under these definitions is completely neglected and rendered invisible. And then another thing I just want to also mention, again, because so much of this data is collected based on perception, sometimes there's a tendency for folks to get miscategorized. So one issue that we know is a problem, particularly in southwestern US, but it can occur here, is that folks with Latino last names may be categorized as Latino when in fact they are not. And so that's a big issue with American Indians living in the Southwest. They may have a Latino or Spanish last name, but not actually have that heritage just based on their geography. Okay, next slide, Brody.
I believe Laura has a point also to say.
Oh, thanks. Hey, Brody, do you want to pop back to that previous slide? So Jen was talking about a change in 1997, and I want to point out, if you look at this definition, there was a major change to the American Indian Alaska Native category in 1997. At that time, the language saying and South America, including Central America, part of this definition was put into this category. This was done without consultation with tribes, and the tribes were very upset by this and still are to this day. They are arguing that this needs to be taken into consideration. My understanding is at the time, OMB folks determined that one way to parse out who was American and Alaska Native from the states would be to look at someone who selected American Indian and not Hispanic. And that those folks that selected American Indian and Hispanic, it would be assumed that they were from Central or South America. Where that gets convoluted is that there are individuals, indigenous individuals from Central and South America who do not consider themselves Hispanic. And so in those instances, and I've had people share this with me, they are selecting not Hispanic and American Indian. And so it really didn't pan out the way that I think the folks at OMB thought it would, and today is causing a lot of data collection issues in every area of work, education, law enforcement, health, et cetera. So wanted to just give that background. What the tribes are pushing for right now is that there is an additional question to ask for tribal affiliation and descendancy status, which goes along with that maintaining tribal affiliation or community attachment. Okay, I think we're passing it to Marlon now.
I don't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry, Laura and Marlon. I see a lot of things in the chat. I just wonder if there's going to be time after the presentation for questions, and if there is, can we hold the questions away from the chat and save them for later? That would be ideal. Will there be questions? Time
Yes.
For okay. Thank you, and I will be quiet.
Go.
Not sharing the call.
Sorry, everyone. My daughter just got hurt, so I was listening. I apologize. So issues in our current system. As it indicates here, broad categories may not represent communities how they wish to be represented. And I think we're going to speak to this a little bit more about how this is how we got to the conversation in general. This is why we're having this presentation and why we wanted to get the community input from you all today. And then people can be categorized under racial identities that does not match their own. And this is an issue that we ran into in my previous role. Prior to working in this role, I was the African American Student Service Coordinator, and we ran into issues with identifying people by their perceived race or ethnicity. And we had an issue where one of the members went to go see somebody. I worked as an African American Student Service Coordinator. They went to go see a different coordinator of a different background, and then they sent them to me because they perceived them as being African American. And when they came to me, they were like, I don't know why they sent me here. I identify as this person. I identify as this group, and they sent me here because I look this way. And then populations undercounting due to perceived race, which is one of the main issues. Like we said, we need to be able to identify these disparities. So we can have disparities in our data, or we can have inaccurate data because of perceived race. And then the system does not recognize multiracial or multi-ethnic identity currently. So we don't have a way of saying I'm this identity or that identity, or we can't put down multiple identities. If we were to develop a new way, we could have a way of them giving us multiple identities if we can do it in a way that's not offensive. If we go to the next slide, I can speak to those issues.
Hey, Marlon, there's a point I forgot to write down on this slide too, but I think is that broad categories can also hide disparities in the sense that, like, imagine you take a community that is fairly prosperous overall, like the white racial category. But if you look inside of that, something like Slavic, you may find a lot of people who are enduring a lot of hardship, but because they're classified, or Middle Eastern people who may be enduring quite a bit of hardship, but the data will hide them because it will lump them together with English descendants, French descendants, or German descendants who are doing rather well. And that can be other communities too. So that's another issue that I forgot to put on the slide. My apologies.
No, thank you for mentioning that. I remember seeing that in the study put together by the Coalition of Communities of Color. So challenges to changing the system. It's important that anything we do be compatible with the federal and state standards, or as Jen mentioned before, we can collect more data than is required now. Officers hesitant to ask questions, perceptions that it could be offensive or dangerous. We do want to be mindful of the fact that sometimes people being pulled over, depending on their identity, feel like they're being pulled over because of their identity. So asking that question may reinforce how they already feel about that. Any process created must be able to meet the needs of multiple communities. And that's going to be hard to develop. Like, how we need to be able to develop a way of doing this in a way in which we can get multiple communities. I have some ideas about that. I'm going to keep them to myself because I don't want to inform the input that we'll get today, but I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what people's suggestions are around that. And then balancing completeness and accuracy against calls for service. And this is probably one of the most minor of the challenges that we have to overcome, but we're going to account for how much time is going to be put into trying to get this information when it takes away from us getting to other calls at the same time, and particularly under our current system where we're having a hard time getting to calls as it is. And Before I switch from those slides, I'd like to open it up to anything from John, Laura, and Jen, or Brody, of anything that I missed. I said I wanted to do that as well.
I think just one other thing that comes to mind that I think is important for PCCEP to know is that the Office of Equity and Human Rights, Danielle Brooks, has been working on creating a new standard operating procedure for collecting race and ethnicity for the entire city. I believe that there's intent to bring that to council. It is very thorough. It does provide a couple of different versions depending on time or space on a form. And so that's also something that I think is important for our PCCEP to know.
Okay, so we are bringing this here for a few different reasons. One is to just get general feedback or questions, so just statements or questions that aren't necessarily giving us anything, but just asking us, or just even getting reactions out there. Thoughts on what an ideal system might be for the police bureau, recording the race of involved parties. And recommendations of any other groups we should speak to. We recognize that any sort of change, especially a change that touches really every single community in Portland, needs to have a lot of input. So this is not something that we expect to turn around and change in a month. This is going to be a bit of a process, and we really want to be thorough in making sure that that whatever we create or whatever we work on proposing really does meet the needs of everyone. So at that point, I am going to stop sharing and start calling on hands. And I'm seeing a hand from Amy A.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I have to breathe because this subject is really near and dear to my heart because I worked for 6 years on a 5-county project around data collection for the health industry. And what we discovered in our journey was that every agency that we tried to get information from, like Medicare, Medicaid, the hospitals, all collect data in a different way. Nobody was the same. The data that we needed to have wasn't available because the federal forms only gave us 5 categories of race to choose from. Made it really complicated when you're looking at how many people have died in certain categories, because I learned we have over 135 different languages spoken in our schools, and there's a top, I think, 10 or 12 language chart that the county uses and the state uses. So I think maybe having the individual offer to identify either on a, like if you gave him a ticket, when he turned it in, there might be a box on there to self-identify. Sometimes we can make it easier for folks if they don't have to answer right away. And a perceived idea that's incorrect is kind of humiliating later for folks. So my experience has been data collection on race and ethnicity. We have to make it a personal choice so that people can tell us rather than we ask them to pick a box. That's just my take. I'll stop.
Thank you, Amy. Lakiana is next.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. My only comment and observation is that from watching this presentation, I feel like y'all have a pretty decent understanding of history of race, how it impacts people, how people are labeled versus, what they might actually identify and all those things. And it's almost like the officers on the street need to have this level of understanding, because it's like based up in just your guys's department, like on the street, you know, in our world today, with the height of, you know, race being such a forefront, I don't meet many officers who seem to understand the nuances and all the pieces that go into that. And so, you know, I mean, I think part of it might be that you all have interest in learning those things and then you've done the work, but that for officers to be effective in today's world, they have to have at least an understanding of what you guys just talked about and be able to articulate it in their own way and understand it and understand how race operates, how people, you know, could be misidentified and what that might look like. So I don't know what that takes, but it's like, you know, and then when you add in the fact that when we look at the data from PPB, it doesn't seem like there's a team like you guys in there, right? Like there's like racialized data that shows year after year. We're going to talk about this a little later, but they're trying to bring back the gun violence reduction team that has atrocious statistics with people of color. And so I'm just, you know, trying to understand where the disconnect is. And it does no good to have a team, you know, like you guys on board if it's not translating to results. And if the people who are on the front lines having to do this work don't know it. You guys should be the police officers. I would be much better understanding if Marlon, you know, was to show up, or any of you, honestly, with an understanding of the dynamics of how race plays. So that's just what I'll say. I think there needs to be further conversations. But if you guys just presented and nobody knew that you're from the Portland Police Bureau, I think that they would be pretty surprised that that's where you guys work for. And leadership needs to figure out how to get your knowledge and either translate to people who are working on the front lines or hire people who have that understanding.
I'm seeing, I see Marcia's hand is next, but I see our equity training specialist just raised her hand. I'm curious if that's a response to Lakiana's point. I'm seeing a nod, so I'm gonna, Marcia, do you mind if I let Lauren go to respond? Okay.
Hi, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Lauren Rosenstein. I'm the equity training specialist over at the Portland Police Bureau. This position was recently created, so I've been here for about 6 weeks now. I'm diving in with 2 feet and I hear everything that you're saying. And so my goal is to be able to take this information, take the policies that are being created in response to directly to community need, and both here within Portland, nationally, right? We're trying to bring this information to the forefront. So it is my job now. I'm here to be held accountable for it, to bring this information to the Bureau at large through trainings that we will create, and also how do we plug them into what exists there currently to make it better. So it's not just, we're working to embed this kind of education within each step of the way, from the very first training that recruits are receiving through to continued. If you have more questions about it, I'll pop my information into the chat. You are welcome to reach out to me. You're welcome to share my information with people. I can answer more specific questions about the different trainings that we have in the hopper right now. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I'm here for it if you have any comments, questions, concerns, feedback.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Marcia, I think you're next.
Yeah, I think just to go a little bit on top of what Lakiana was saying, one of the areas race data comes up a lot is in stops data, and PPB often struggles discussing this data. And so you don't have to answer right now, but I'm just curious, like, how will changing the data collection improve how PPB addresses the racial disparities that do exist in stop data that have a community concerned about racist policing? It's something that we hear about often, but I think it's been 2 years now where we had a conversation about gun and gang violence, and The Bureau had a difficult time discussing, like getting, caught up in race data and stops data. It's something that I don't feel like is often successfully articulated and explained well. And so that's one thing that just came up to me. And then in December, we had a community member, one of the panelists asked folks to talk about what they understood to be racism. And frankly, the Bureau really struggled responding to that. And so how do you intend to use this data? And to Lauren's comment about training and stuff, I think that's really great that you have these trainings, but I think the community at large is pushing for the Bureau to change its culture, not just to be trained. I mean, it has to be truly embedded into the Bureau as a whole. And so, again, doesn't require a response, but something to think about. The stops data thing is a big deal.
Yeah, I have some, maybe not a response, but some points that brings up for me. But I see Lauren might want to respond to the training aspect a bit, so I'll let her go first, and then I'll jump in.
I appreciate that as well. I agree. I think that a lot of what we've seen in the past has been a check the box, right? Of like, let's get this training done, we're out of here. And my goal is to build these trainings so that we're also attaching the ethical component. We're attaching the there's a specific word that I'm thinking of that I'm suddenly blanking right now. But there's empathy training that goes along with it. There's cultural competency, which I actually just learned should be called cultural humility trainings. So that all goes into the change in culture, the training in culture, right? So I know that training or changing culture is one of the hardest things to do. And it's not to say that I'm not going to take it on. I just finished a course called it's a course that's put on by the Auschwitz Institute for the prevention of mass atrocities and genocide, along with the Civil Rights Institute. And they take these, like all of these ideas, and they build this training that is, I mean, I encourage you to look, I can pop it into the chat as well, the information for it. My goal is to take a lot of what I've learned there and build what we have so that it incorporates that empathy, the cultural humility, all of these other cultural pieces that I'm hoping we can start to move. And also, I know that I'm, Viva la Revolution, and this is going to be a long-term plan. So as much as I want to say, yep, we're doing it, I also know that we're going to be checking in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So, I mean, like, we're playing the long game here.
Thank you, Lauren. And kind of to the point, I think it's interesting when you talk about race data and what's that impact on stops, because I think there are probably two interrelated but separate conversations about changing protocol in terms of more complete police reports, especially for, because this project, kind of how it came about was through a discussion with Laura John about really fears around the dramatic undercounting of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so that kind of came up as a way to say, do we know who in the community is most suffering? And to kind of my point about Slavic and under the category of white, but that could also go with, for example, if you found that Vietnamese or Cambodian under the category of Asian were suffering at a disproportionate rate, and there was the ability of the and Lord John has a comment following my point. So I think that is one of the things. When it comes to stops data, I think there's an interesting question about whether in some ways you want to know what the race of the actual identity of the person is, or if you kind of want to know the perceived race, because if people are being profiled, they're being profiled based on their perceptions. So in that case, perceived might be more useful, but it might be more useful on the other hand to be able to use whatever new system. So I don't have an answer for that, but I think that is a good question to discuss. Because I think especially when it comes to stops, those are going to be heavily based on the perceptions if is going to be the best way to identify profiling. Laura, John, you got a follow up to?
Yeah, thanks. So just to clarify, one thing before I say my comment, I don't work in the police bureau. So I'm in City Hall. I work in the Office of Government Relations. I advise the 26 bureaus and 6 elected offices. And so in that role at the city, this conversation has come up about the core data that is collected to track victimization of Native women. I started that conversation with my liaison at the police bureau and started to get a little more background on that. Basically, what I heard is that officers are uncomfortable and they feel that if they ask someone's race, that person's going to think they're being profiled. My response to that staff member at PPB was, well, but you can also hide profiling if you're not accurately collecting racial data. That is a way to hide and less, in my opinion, less of an instance of suggesting to someone that they're being profiled, because whether they ask that or not, and even how they present, they may have, like the stop stated, they may have something on their person, on their vehicle, that is suggesting that they are a person of color, that could be triggering implicit bias. It could be an accent. And so there are all of these other things. One other thing that I don't think was mentioned in the presentation, I think we forgot to mention it, is once someone's identity is set in the system, that perceived by the officer is set in the system, that individual doesn't know what that is. They would only know that if they were to request records. And so if there is another incident with police, that person's racial identity doesn't change. It follows with every other incident that they have with police where that information is taken. And so there is not a mechanism now for people to know how they've been identified by an officer and to correct that if they choose to do so. So I think that's something else to take into consideration, that it's possible that if people are aware that they could change that, maybe not in that moment, it doesn't feel safe for them. In that moment, when they have that interaction with an officer, it may not feel safe for them. But if they know that this is a way that the city of Portland can track any disparities that are existing, they may choose at a later time to go back and make sure that that is accurate.
Can I jump in real quick? Or Marcia, is your hand still raised? Or is that still raised? Or all right, cool. First of all, thank you all for having us here again. I want to say that I love coming to these meetings, even if we're not presenting. But there's a question in here about hiring I want to get to. We are working on hiring and diversifying the Bureau. We'll be hiring an analyst soon, and a big part of their role primarily will be sifting through the hiring practices and identifying ways in which we may be losing women and people of color in the hiring process. So we're really excited about that. In addition to that, there was a question around what we're going to do. Sorry, my screen just tripped. I think Lauren did a good job of explaining what we're doing. We're trying to change a culture with the trainings. We do want these trainings to help change attitudes and people's ability to talk more about race. But in the end, I want to change experiences for those in the community as well as outcomes. So I wanted to do these trainings in the way where we're gauging whether or not, are we seeing a shift in our 2.02 complaints around harassment and stuff like that? Are we seeing a drop in the stops data concerns that Marcia brought up earlier? And And then I also just want to make sure that we're identifying these people right. So I know that I don't want to spend up too much time. I want to get more community input. I'm trying to take notes on that. I do have some ideas around that. And I said I didn't want to do that because I don't want to influence our decisions, but it would be nice if we were able to more accurately capture that data in a way that's not going to offend particular groups. Because I do understand that there's different sentiments depending on what group you come from or what community you come from around an officer asking you what your racial identity is. And you want to do that in a way that doesn't make it, depending on where you're coming from, that may trigger all kinds of signs. You're like, oh man, he's worried about my immigration status. He's pulled me over because I was Black, or he pulled me over because I was Latino. So we don't want to reinforce those sentiments. And that's going to be a part of the training component too as well. We need to do training on making sure that we're doing this in the correct way. So nothing about this, what we're asking you all is easy. I don't want to pretend like it is. We do need to figure all those aspects out, but we do want to make sure that we're getting community input. That being said, I don't want to take up too much of our time speaking on it. I do have some ideas around it. I'm not going to put them out there. I'll bring them to, but I just want to get the community input. Like if you have any ideas, how should we go about gathering race data? And if you have any suggestions, drop them in the comments. I don't want to take up too much from their agenda, so you can drop those in the comments and I'll copy them and put them in my notes, or you can email us and I can put my email in there as well. But we definitely want to figure out creative ways of going about making sure we're getting accurate data so we can see if there's disparities that we're not capturing, and to do it in a way that's not going to offend the community.
Thanks, Marlon. We are a little past our time now, so if folks have thoughts, feel free to send them in the chat like Marlon said. If you could put your email, Marlon, in there, and if you think about it later, go ahead and send them an email, or you can also send them to us and I'm happy to forward it to you. If folks also have feedback on what other groups, I saw that in the last slide, what other groups you can be soliciting feedback from. If you all have, information, go ahead and send that to them. I have a suggestion on taking comments. Do folks have any quick comments they want to make before we move on? Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you. I think this is a great what you're doing, because just getting the category, you know, where people are focusing on the culture, because just getting the categories right, that can be okay. But if the officer sort of doesn't care, or if the system doesn't care who people are, then they just look at it as a complication and get annoyed. I've just seen people react in that way. So I think that changing the culture is the most important thing. Thank you. Thanks,
Barbara. It's a great point. I see some great things in the chat. Should I read those? Let's see. Trudy asked the question, to bring about culture change, competence, and humility, what approaches in addition to training are you considering? For example, do you use organization development approaches with officers, where you gather officers' perspectives safely and confidentially, hear the definition of problems and solutions, summarize that, present them back without attribution, and then work on solutions together, and then make recommendations as far as expert viewpoint. Amy talks about programs that allow for individual and to specify their answers, including audio recording. Zainab, this is a great point to make. Data collected is based on not just stops, but documentation of stops. So how can it be certain about stops not documented in data collected by officer, and not the person being stopped? Could there be an electronic process to gather through a tab where a person can submit their own data? Let's see. Before I read the next one, do you all want to chime in? Anyone want to chime in?
I can chime in really briefly.
Okay.
So, you know, I think I would be curious to hear what everyone else would think about creating a database that would essentially track people's race data when they have not had other contact with the police, because like that makes me feel a little uncomfortable. There is no like centralized database of everyone's identities, right? And in some respects that's a good thing, and in some it's not as positive of a thing. So yeah, it's an interesting idea. I'd like to see what thoughts are.
I'm just going to read Kia's last comment, and then we're going to move on to our topic, our other topic of the evening. So Kia's question is with regards to training. As you develop training, she'd like to recommend banking in regular checkpoints or certifications with officers, that they are not one and done trainings. Consistency and intentionality is one key way to bring about behavior and mindset shifts. So I think that's really great feedback as well.
I would actually like to let Lauren chime in if she's still here, but I do want to go ahead and let them know that, like she said, we don't want to do this checkbox approach. Right now, we're currently rolling out a series of trainings on a regular basis around equity-related concepts. It was initially rolled out as our anti-racism trainings, but we're going to be talking about a number of concepts, and they'll be rolling out on our LMS system on a monthly basis. So moving forward, the Bureau will be getting introduced to concepts around equity more frequently than they ever have in the history of the Portland Police Bureau. And in addition to that, thank you, Jen. In addition to that, she's going to be, like she mentioned earlier, embedding concepts into our current training. So she's already started to attend some of the trainings, and she'll be evaluating and identifying ways in which, like, our work touches everything. So there shouldn't be a reason we're not making equity considerations in all of our training. So she's going to be working through looking for opportunities to embed that everywhere. And then I'm not sure about the certifications, but I'm working on the promotional process, and I want to make sure that, like, if you're going to be considered for promotion as a sergeant, as a lieutenant, or anything and above, that you're going to be leading with equity, and that there is equity embedded into what is required to become part of that process. So I'm not sure, I hadn't thought about a certification process, but that's something that we can consider. And I'll go ahead and pass the mic to Lauren.
I don't really have too much to add to that. The only thing that I want to say is, I'm going to be, it's the royal I, it's not really me, it's everyone, right? So the equity team, the training division, we're trying to work really closely with each other so that we can make sure that there is consistency and intentionality, so that it is not one and done. Right now, as we're, finding some of these best practice models, our goal is to bring them in to PPB. We want to have them vetted by both external partners and stakeholders, community members, and internal. We still need to make sure that it is appropriate for law enforcement use, and to have those checkpoints. So to have it as, let's try this out with this group of people, including community members, and then revisit it. Did it meet the need? Community members, did it meet the need? Internal folks, did it meet the need? And then revise. So I'm thinking that it's more than just a yearly basis, especially in the first round of it. I'm looking at it as soon as it's over, let's immediately evaluate, and then let's move through to create those revisions. 6 months, let's review it again. So, again, I'm talking like really long term here, and that it's going to have to be a lot of, it's the snake eating its own tail. We're just going and figuring it out, and eventually we're going to change the world.
Appreciate that, Lauren. We're gonna, just for the sake of time, move on to our next topic, which is on gun violence. We're at 20, or it might even be 21 deaths now this year related to gun violence. And so we've got a number of folks that are going to speak, and then we want to open the floor up to community as well. The first person that we're going to have up is Canada Taylor Parker. And I don't know, Marcy, if you want to introduce her, or Canada, if you just want to take over from there, but we appreciate having you here today.
Yeah, thank you. And let me stack my streams correctly. Okay. So I'm going to try to get through this. I'm going to try to make this 5 minutes. I know others want to speak and there are other things to say, but I have a lot to share with you. And I'm going to do this very differently than kind of how this meeting has gone, because you guys are so on top of the business. I'm going to take you really far outside of that. I want you in a whole different place. So just hang with me here. It will make sense. So each and every one of you who is here today, undoubtedly you do community work. Somehow you were called into community, something about you, it made sense for you to do that. And as each of you tries to figure out what does that mean for you, I also in my own time had to sit with that a little bit too. And I thought, well, what do I do? Someone asked me, what do you do for work? Well, I like to tackle things that make people uncomfortable. Those are the places that I always find for work, no matter what the topic is. And I'll give you an example. So about 8 years ago, I was shopping at Walmart, embarrassingly enough. I try not to go there now, but tough times. And I was at Walmart and my makeup is streamed all over my face. Like I looked like very much, you guys know the website, the people at Walmart, like everything's falling apart. My clothes are like just like looking terrible. And I'm walking through the store, my face is puffy, and someone I know sees me, which of course I'm very horrified at. And I'm like, hello, as I clear my voice. And she's like, wow, what's going on with you? How are you doing? Are you okay? And I was like, well, no, my husband died 2 weeks ago. Stop. Full stop to that conversation. Now, that conversation stopped because one, she wasn't expecting an honest answer, because culturally, we don't always give people the honest answer about how are you really doing? We just say, yeah, I'm great, thanks, bye. But two, I realized in that moment that I was going through hell. I was still able to stop and talk with somebody about it that I hadn't seen in a long time. We had an amazing discussion about it. And so for the last 5.5 years of my life, part of my own journey and being called into work was working with folks grieving, working with folks going through the things that other people can't always talk about, the ugly stuff and the muck, and wading through it. And while our culture is wonderful at talking about death, we're not good at talking about grief, what comes afterwards. Now I'll tell you what I do. So my name is Kat, it's she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm currently working in Multnomah County doing suicide prevention research. And I also still work in the death care industry. I'm providing support to families to help them tell their stories. Now, telling a story is something we all do. It's something that's ancient for every culture on earth, so we somehow figure out how to tell a story. But stories about grief have a different meaning. Now, we know with our youth who die by gun violence, by suicide, by anything traumatic, the way that story is told sets us up for a journey of grief as a community in a way that's very different than we tell other stories. Now, many of you obviously know about the bias shown in media where you see photos of someone like, oh, this person's been arrested, and they happen to be a white younger man, and there's a beautiful college picture of them in their swimsuit. Yeah. And then, you know, you see the Black person who did not commit the crime looking like the worst picture ever of them shown in the paper. We all have a bias in our head. We all have this way in which the media expresses that to us. But we have the same thing around grief. When we talk about those that we lost, those that we long for, those that we feel certain hurt for, we don't show pictures of children and teenagers and young adults who've been murdered. We don't always show those pictures. We show pictures of the people who died from cancer, which of course is horrible. But anyone in your community who dies, no matter what or how, but especially when it's traumatic, we need to make space to grieve about that, not just privately, but publicly, to honor that, because part of the grief journey is to figure out what do we make of this relationship now that it's changed? Because the relationship doesn't end with all of those who've died. How are you changed from that relationship? When someone dies by gun violence, that changes your life. There is a traumatic aspect to that, and though you may not be traumatized by it, there's that possibility. The safety in your community changes, your own personal feelings about yourself in relation to life changes. And so today, what I bring to you as a topic in a very condensed form, because there's so much to talk about with this, is how we really step around the meat of what death really means. Because death changes you. You cannot live through a death, the death of someone you love, or the death of someone further from you, and not be changed, and not see life differently, and not somehow adapt, and have perseverance and resilience from that. We don't talk about that. We know people have to do it, but we don't talk about it. We talk about how the murder happened. We talked about, look at the crime scene. We talk about trends and data. But at the end of the day, every single one of us will die, and someone will tell our story. And we all hope that that story told about us is something that changes other people for the better, that there's positivity left behind, even in the face of trauma, even in the face of violence. So I would love to have an opportunity for any of you who would like to express your own views on what community grief looks like, how that grief can be transformative, how those who have died by violence, by trauma, by suicide, that their faces and voices can still be seen and heard, even when they make us uncomfortable. That's what I'm here for today. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Canada. Just listening to this and kind of taking a check at time, we are gonna focus on this for just the remainder of the evening, knowing that we don't have you for another time slot. So we'll just kind of continue this conversation. I know Mary Claire was going to present some pieces, and I think there was one more speaker. But we're just going to kind of wrap this meeting up on this topic of trauma and grief, because I think it's a really important one. And if there's a couple more minutes of things that you wanted to have, or if you want to open it up to community to ask their questions, we can do that. But we will give you the floor till about the floor and the space for community to about 6:55.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that. And as for other things I would add to those, you know, I had a lot of questions, and I've worked with so many families from so many different communities in the last 5 years, but I know everyone has their own grief traditions, and trauma is so unique when you experience a traumatic death. And I don't know if between all of you at the agencies you might work in or your parts of the community that you kind of engage with, I am curious if there has ever been a moment that you've had a communal grief ritual, a place in which you might stop and pause and figure out how to talk with others about these deaths, especially the number of youth this year already, the gun violence. How do you talk about that? And I'm just curious, you don't have, no answer is perfect. There's no yes or no or right or wrong in this, but just curious, what have you all done so far? What's helped you? What's maybe not helped you?
If you all want to use like the raise your hand feature, oh, Amy, you already got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's why I did that first. Yeah, Canada, what you said just like, woo, chilled my heart. It was so good. One of the things that I found very interesting, you know, like, I've been widowed 3 times, and I'm not going to go into the rest of it, but you get it. But what I found to be very interesting was we've lost like 3 clients last year due to deaths, you know, some suicide, some unknown. And as a team of, you know, people who love these people as workers, we gathered together, and it was incredible. One of my team members made a quilt, and in the quilt, each of us took like pieces of material, and she made stars for each individual that passed away, you know, that was in our program. And we had a little get together saying candlelight event. And it was so touching because I've never experienced professional feelings around grief, you know, where you're the professional and you lose someone who's a person you've been working with, you know, and yeah, it's a very difficult emotion trying to be professional and still honor that grieving process. So I would definitely love to learn more about it or hear what your experience is, because maybe that's what community grief sort of kind of like stems on, is like when other people pass away that you're real passionate about, how do you feel like when you're, you know, when it's not a loved one, you know, you're right, it's a very difficult subject. So I'm more than interested in learning more about that process, like community grieving, how and what, you know, or maybe different groups have different ways, you know, and that too needs to be explored. So that's just my take on it. Thank you. You just touched my heart. It was awesome.
Well, Amy, I just want to say thank you for sharing part of your own grief story. It's really, I know, you know, as a widow, you get used to talking about it with folks, but it's still never easy. Not really. You still have to talk about things, and sometimes people you can fall into a place where you don't expect. So I appreciate that. And I do want to kind of circle back to what you're saying, but I can hear maybe what some other folks are saying and maybe pull it back together too, because I have an idea. And Marlon, you were raising your hand. Hi.
Yeah, I don't have the option. I didn't want to clap. That's the only other option I have on my reactions. Well, first of all, Canada, it's nice to meet you. I like blown away by what you did in a short amount of time. Your work is very interesting. I just want to say I lost 2 people before during a time in which I didn't have any steps or processes or for managing the grief around that. I didn't have any healthy way of managing that. So I lost a dear friend of mine's here in Portland. He got stabbed to death. This was, I think, around 2009, 2010. It was really bad, messed up situation. And during that time, I didn't have a good methods for managing that. But shortly after that, in around 2011, I started working as the African American Student Service Coordinator. And as all those shootings that were coming up with the killing of Black men, I started creating space for my students to discuss those things. And then me and my wife also started creating space for members in the community. We would invite people over for brunches. It was like, hey, we know that this is heavy. Why don't you come over here? I said, there's no agenda. Over here, we're gonna be with each other, support each other. We would make brunch and cook a meal or whatever. We lived in an apartment with a rooftop, and we would just go sit on the roof or whatever, depending on the weather, or just be in our house. And it would be like a happy hour brunch. Sometimes we get into deep conversations. I would put on my record player or whatever. It was really good and healthy. What I did learn from that experience, and when I was doing that at PSU, is a lot of students brought me a lot of their information. A lot of people would pour their trauma onto me, and I literally felt like I started to suffer from secondary trauma. And I was wondering how you manage that with the work that you do, because it gets heavy when people pour on all that they do with you all the time. And I was just in a role where people were doing that regularly. And I would just love to know how you manage it, since that's such a big part of your work. And thank you again for your presentation. That was amazing.
No, thank you. And that is a great question. I had more planned for you, but I was trying to hush for you through. So thank you all for your patience with me. Okay, I'm pulling this all together. Do we have anyone else who has a piece or a topic you want me to bring up as well with us?
Yeah. Sorry, was there anybody else that had their hand up again? Okay, cool. No, thank you so much. And that's precisely why I reached out to Canada. Obviously, you're super captivating. The first time I heard you speak about death, and I thought it was like beautifully morbid. And I unfortunately have also experienced death from a very, very young age. You know, I remember going to grief counseling and thinking it was super corny when I was 10 years old, and I thought it was the stupidest thing in the world. But now, being older, it probably was very impactful. And the conversation came up, and the reason why when I was listening to Canada speak at a meeting we were at last week, was that, you know, there was, as you know from the work that I do previously at the juvenile department, most of you are aware, I supervised many youth on supervision for gun charges, and have been to many funerals of clients that I've served, young people, and just in the past 5 years have lost many young people to gun violence. And of recent, those people who used to be on supervision being murdered by gun violence just in the last few weeks. And so as these shootings have happened over time, especially in this last year and frankly the last few months, I thought it was important, as I was hearing Canada speak about, like, how do we allow community to grieve, and what do we do to learn about what happened in those instances as a community, be transparent about what opportunities were missed, either by social service agencies or, you know, the city, the county, community. Where is it that we're offering space for people to grieve and process, so that we don't continue the ripple effect of violence, because it tends to be, you know, when you think about it from a public health approach, like this is contagious, where it just, people are suffering from significant trauma, both by interpersonal violence and trauma and vicarious trauma. So if you're working in the field, you're carrying a lot of that home, and you know, you can't take care of others unless you're taking care of yourself. And also, not everybody can do this work, right? So I think I don't really have a question necessarily, but rather just acknowledging that everybody's story is really important. And when we talk about gun violence, and we're not just talking about statistics and the number of shootings and the number of bullets that are flying, but the harm and the healing that needs to happen in our community so that we can slow it down. And also, where there is trauma, there is also healing. And so what does that look like for us? And so I wanted to invite Canada here tonight to have a different conversation than just like an enforcement-based, suppression-based, intervention-based conversation. So I hope that we can continue to hear from you. Thank you.
I'm sorry, my dogs are barking because people are moving about in the house, so that'll stop soon. And I see one more hand raised. I don't want to mess up your name.
We got one more hand. Let's take this last one and then allow Canada to respond to all of these. Zainab, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Canada. I had a question and then was really piggybacking off of what Marcia just expresses. You know, how do you deal with this? Giving, you know, where you are. And that's what I was thinking about when you were telling your story is, wow, how are you managing through all this and with your own trauma? And how do you take care of yourself while you're taking care of others, basically? Yes, thank you.
That is a great question. Or see, I see your hand raised. Is it just from a raise? Okay, no problem. Just checking. You all have so many good questions. And I had a feeling that they would kind of overlap and tie together. That's why I wanted to kind of hear what everyone thought first. So the first thing really raised is professionally, all of you in your various professional environments undoubtedly will face loss in a way in which you are connected to someone more professionally than personally. And how do you deal with that? Well, my answer is a little bit messier than what a lot of people will tell you, especially I come from a behavioral health background. And we know in behavioral health, client, patient, this person's way over here and you're over here, even though we will talk about how we all work together and, you know, we try to support them and we're not power over. The truth is that the medicalization of behavioral health and physical health, of course, is that, you know, there's only so much you can do with that person because they're not your person. You're treating them, you're helping them. But the truth is, when you really get down to the core of grief and the mess of it, and I say this with so much research, but in addition to all the experience and the literally hundreds of families I've sat and talked with, is that you really can't separate them from yourself. And that's actually part of the reason why it's so damaging to us when we don't grieve people in our community who die. Now, when I say that, obviously, if someone's not as close to you, you're not going to have that same feeling for them, but yet there is a grief there. There's a loss of life potential, a loss of relationships, a loss of this person you may have interacted with, a loss of knowing youth is gone from this world, of all the wonder that comes with life, because we all know, even though we work in things that are messy and can be ugly, there's wonder and beauty in life. And we just have to sit with that and acknowledge that this is gone for somebody, and how terrible. But that person, as another human being, is a cousin of yours, whether distant or closer. We are all one giant family, and then we all have to do our professional work, our due diligence, and, you know, keep our professional boundaries. The truth is, if a child who lives a couple miles from your house dies, whether it's in a car accident or from cancer, by gun violence or by suicide, that child is related to you in some way. That child, the ripple of that child's life affects you. That young adult, that parent, whoever they might be who dies, they are so connected to you. So the problem is, how do you integrate knowing that these people, it's okay to care about them deeply and personally when they die, even though we do our best not to have that space professionally? I'm not saying it's an easy struggle. Like, you know, it's not like you can instantly come to it, but that place of knowing I can hold you and love you and care about you, and you not be someone who's close enough to just have the key to my house. We struggle with that language in our English, really, because we have love, and love just means usually someone you're very close to, but we know love is complicated and love is varied, and there are many levels of it. Literally, I tell people I love them all the time, and I truly mean it, but that love is necessarily doesn't give the same permissions or the same intimacy or closeness. And I think that's how you have to think of grief, that you are grieving for that person, but also with the other people. You don't know who knows them personally, and that may come up. So no matter, especially in our big small town of Portland, I think you're always connected to people much more than you know. And so I look at every single death here as like, did I know them? And it's not just because I worked in death care, because believe me, I'd be like, well, I might be taking care of this family. Let me look, because I managed to put myself in that place of I'm going to help. And this is how I deal with grief, because so much of my own grief work was really getting out to be like, let me sit with people in it, because this is messy for me, but I can do this. I can sit with this, and that's my superpower. So I'm going to bring that to other people, and it's going to help me in my own grief. It's like, I always call myself a peer grief specialist. You know, in behavioral health, it's like I didn't have all the same things, and so I could support and be with. But it's different to actually be someone who's experienced and sit with it. But with grief, basically all of us experience grief in some way, whether it's a loss of opportunities, where it's 2020 that has continued kind of into 2021, and we're grieving so many different things and secondary losses. A lot of public grief and community grief really is about secondary losses. Those losses that they don't seem direct immediately, as if you've had someone in your life die and now, wait, we don't take this vacation anymore because that person planned it. You realize when you're grieving how a piece of your life is connected to this person who's died. So if that kind of makes sense in answering your question, it's like, don't separate them, you know, keep it personal, but yet also in a way that is not about you. And that's, you know, I don't know if anyone's ever seen The Circle of Grief in the New York Times, where at the center of it is the people who are closest to you, the people who you can lean on and lean into, and you can both grieve together at that same very intense level. And each circle goes out as someone who's further away from the person who died, whether it be a friend circle next, whether it be kind of acquaintances on the next circle, whether it be people out in the public who know about it, maybe they worked with them occasionally. All those people need to support and need to grieve, but they have to lean into their own level of the circle. And so if you're at that level where you're not personally in that person's life, but it does affect you, or maybe you did work and serve them in some way, you did the right thing in talking about grieving together, having a work ritual. I think every single workplace needs to have a process in which you actually plan to grieve when a coworker or someone you serve or someone who is connected to your team dies, because we all will experience this eventually, unfortunately. And that to have a plan in place, to know who you call in, because maybe no one on your team is going to be able to support you through it, but you know who you need to call from someone else who comes in to take care of you. That if you have EAP in your workplace, what can they do for you? Because sometimes they can have a trauma team that drops in, kind of like their own little team that comes onto your site and says, okay, let's talk with you. There are ways to do that can be very helpful. And so those are just some of those ideas about that and in terms of doing that work. But yes, you should honor the grief, know that it's yours to hold, and also just know to keep it with those who are closest to you and not to push more grief onto the people who are most affected. So like a two-part answer there, if that makes sense. Okay, I'm trying to blast through. I'm like, okay, make through.
That was great.
And then also,
that helped me. Thank you.
okay, good. And then we're talking about kind of, I see it's typed in the box, vicarious trauma. And that is, you know, that's such a heavy thing, the vicarious trauma of work, and especially when you have death, and as to kind of how I've dealt with it. And I think other death care professionals I've worked with over the years and known, not that different than healthcare professionals. You know, sometimes people find some not so pro-social ways to deal with things, right? They make all the wrong choices to be like, I'm gonna numb this, I'm gonna forget about it. It's so tough. And what I did was I decided to be vulnerable. Like, someone asked me how things are doing. This is terrible. Did you know that this person died? How horrible is that? I wonder how they, you know what? I think I could take something over to their house. I don't even know them, but I found out their address. I'm going to drop something off. I go into that vulnerable space where now I am a part of this solution or this puzzle or a support for the grief. And so even in vicarious trauma and workplace trauma and carrying around the grief of others all the time, I make it more, it's not just grief that you sit with, but grief is an action, much like love. So grief is a feeling, but I also believe grief can be an action, whether that be lighting a candle at home and just taking a minute to be quiet or sing a song, or actually saying, you know what, I don't know what they need, but I bet they probably go shop at Target and get toilet paper sometimes. So you know what, I'm going to drop a $50 Target gift card at their house. I got some stuff I cooked. I got these things I grew in my garden. I'm just going to put them over there because I don't have a whole lot, but I have beautiful roses I grow. I'm going to cut them and just write a note and say, I'm thinking of you, because I don't have the language necessary to relate to each and every person's grief. But what I do to carry it so that I don't own all of that grief is to give back and to love those people, and to love them as a neighbor, to love them as a friend, to love them as a coworker who I see is hurting. And so I really do feel grief is an action word in terms of how we live it. And whether that be the emotional part of talking about our feelings with people, you know, or getting together and eating a meal together, which I thought was a beautiful story, Marlon, that's so healing for people, just to sit together in a room and eat and make space. Just to be together doing anything is an amazing thing. So healing can be very simple, some of the things that we do to heal. But I think it's important to know that grief is an action. It's something that we actively do, that we grieve forever. So grief just changes. It's like, you know, one day it's blindingly bright light, and then one day you realize, wow, it's like Pluto out there. I see it, but it's not blinding me anymore. It's still a planet in my galaxy, but it's not one so much that I can't function. That's how grief works, even when it's professional and you carry other people's stuff with you. I learned how to take it and make it joy. And I know that sounds corny as hell. Like, I make it joy, but I really do. I don't know if you all know the poet Mary Oliver, but she talks about, what is your plan to do with your one wild and precious life? It's one of her poems. And I remember the first time I read that, she talked about just falling in the grass, kneeling in the grass, just to be idle and blessed in a non-religious sense, but simply to be blessed by that experience. And I think about, how am I doing that? How am I being present? How am I able to, even when it's just one wild and precious summer day that we all have, making that day count? And that means even there might be weeds in the garden, or there might be rocks and I might cut my foot, but I'm still in the day. And I talk a lot about that with people, and then make it in a way that it's not necessarily cheesy. I know there's another quote that I thought of where, you know, how many times in a lifetime does summer turn to fall? You know, and I thought about that a lot, because a lot of you, especially if you experience grief, you've probably experienced other losses in your life. You may have experienced other trauma. So when my husband passed, well, I had a pretty traumatic childhood, unfortunately. My ACEs are high. I've been homeless as a child. I've owned my house since I was 18. And I'll tell you, financially, your life gets turned upside down when you lose the person who also earns money with you. So that re-triggered that. And I was like, okay, let me figure out a plan around this. I'm going to go to a therapist, you know, because I work in behavioral health, so I felt comfortable. But it's acknowledging that no grief, no trauma is on its own. It's not isolated. It's not in a void. When a child dies, when a youth dies, when an adult dies, when a parent dies, especially by violence and trauma, they may have died, but there were other traumas likely around that situation. And what are we doing with those? And so when my husband died, I said, what am I going to do about all this other trauma now that's been re-triggered and I thought had moved on in my life, but now it's all come back and boiled in my face. What am I going to do with that? And I don't think that's necessarily very different in the public sphere. It's just, how do we talk about that and say, wait a minute, I had a site I worked at once, and a woman was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. And let me tell you, that site changed so much. And when we had another coworker who had an abusive boyfriend, everybody's hackles got up, and nobody could really talk about it, because they couldn't say, I think it's because one of our coworkers murdered a few years ago. No one actually put the two together. And I said, you know what? I think she's in a better situation, and I think she's going to be okay. But I know why we're worried, because we're still carrying around this grief and this trauma from this person who came into work and threatened everyone, and then killed this person that was this amazing woman that we got to know and love. That changes you. And so you have to honor where people come from too. And especially with violent death, it's rare that that just happens and there's no other history, there's no other thing in that person's life or their family's life that isn't in some way been difficult or challenging for them. And so honoring both of those things together. And when you do that, I think that also helps you kind of put it in a better place in terms of not carrying all the heavy muck with you. I also have goats. I got chickens. I play a lot of video games. I read a lot. I do weird art. When you talk about, people talk about self-care, it's like, it's not just, I took a shower today, that's self-care, wah wah. If your boss tells you that's self-care, you need to tell them to grow up. That's not it. That's just having hygiene. Like, self-care is finding those things that fill you up, that make you excited about life. And I will tell you, when my husband died, I realized, you know what, no day is guaranteed. We all know that. But I knew at that moment, if I didn't live my life and go out and do things to actually live my life, I would have not learned a thing from that moment. That to honor him and everything that he did with me in our lives together, I need to go out there and get it. So I took a year off of work altogether and just did acting. And I actually did okay. I actually made some money. I was on Grimm for 2 seasons. So maybe episodes, but I did things to make this world a place where I could celebrate again and find joy and beauty. And how can you do that? And I didn't have a whole lot of money. Like, I was bootstrapping. I can't even tell you, I had all kinds of ways to hustle, all legal, to make sure everything was taken care of. But I did those things because I needed to remember that life was so precious and amazing. And so I love to talk to people about that and how they find that just individually and with families, about finding that joy again. But that's so much what we do. So yeah, that's how you carry the pain. It doesn't necessarily not get carried with you. It's just the joy overwhelms it. That's a simple answer.
Canada, that was beyond simple. That was great. Thank you so much. This is really great, and I hope that people took a lot away from this. This is a different type of dialogue we had this evening. I just want to thank you immensely, Canada, for taking the time out of, I'm sure, your busy day. We are just about at time. If folks have any last minute questions, I'll assume that you can stay on for just a minute, but typically we end right at 7. But Lakiana, did you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if people are open to this, but I really appreciate what you were saying, Canada. I was just wondering if we could take like a moment just to reflect and maybe invite people to put names of people that they've lost in the chat, and we can just kind of take a moment of silence. And if people are interested in doing that, you don't have to put a name in there, but I thought it'd be just a great way to commemorate what you said this evening.
Lakiana, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I was just inviting folks to, in the chat, just put the names of people that they're remembering or grieving, and then we'll take a moment of silence and just reflect on that and then close up the meeting.
Thanks.
Thanks to everyone who's dropping names in there, and then we'll just, just take a moment of silence just to remember all of these folks that we put in there and other people. And then I'll turn it back over to Marcia to close us up.
Thank you all. I appreciate seeing all of those names in the chat, sending so much love and strength to all of you. This was a wonderful space, and I just love your energy, Canada. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. We have we're just going to wrap up. I'm going to give you the date for our next full body meeting, which is next Tuesday, I believe. We'll be going over, what day is that? Let me see, calendar. Next Tuesday from 5 to 8 p.m. I don't see if the agenda is posted up there, but hopefully you all can make it. We'll give some updates. And then Canada, if you could provide your contact, if you haven't, some folks would love to connect with you if you're available. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. This was great. Hope people appreciated hearing another perspective on the impacts of violence in our community and death in particular.
Yeah, I just want to also thank everybody for sharing those names. That was very vulnerable and real, and I appreciated being able to see everybody participate in that.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Canada. Great to see you.
Yes, good to see you. Are you
I know, it's been, yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah.
You look fantastic. I love what you're doing. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Good night.
See you, Marlon. Amy.